The next to last story that we have read in Unit 12, written by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, our book identifies her as a New England local color writer. And it should be noted that this is quite different from the New England writers that we have already looked at. Earlier in the 19th century, writers such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and I could name others, were from Massachusetts, or Emily Dickinson, for example, from further west in Massachusetts. All of these writers were from New England at a time when it was the peak of the literary world in America, when Boston had the kind of centrality to art that, say, London does in England and always did, or any other major city did in a European country. But that time had ended by the turn of the 20th century, and now New England was simply another local color area, a place where the dialect and the quirks and the particular human qualities of the people living in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, the furthest northeast portion of the United States, became the province of a few writers, most notably two that I will be talking about more in this video: Sarah Orne Jewett, whom you have already read, and Mary Wilkins Freeman. What our book describes as her theme is the decline of New England, the frustrated, proud, strong-willed characters, many of them middle-aged spinsters, who are left after their more adventurous and creative have gone west. In other words, the West was the place for the brave, the young, the strong, the pioneers, those who were willing to go out and live the very hard life described in Hamlin Garland's great stories in well-traveled, Maine-traveled roads, which we'll be talking about later. There's a saying that to the rest of the world a Yankee is an American, to an American a Yankee is a New Englander, and to a New Englander a Yankee is a real old, crusty New Englander from way up north in some small village in Maine or somewhere. And these are the people that Mary Wilkins Freeman writes about, the ones that still today are seen as independent, as ornery and stubborn, as set in their ways, as seeming a little unfriendly, perhaps to outsiders, but with their own kind of character and their own kind of hard-working moral strength. And certainly this is what Freeman's characters, such as Candace and her nephew Wilson and his fiancée Alma, the characters of this story, seem to be like. A village singer is essentially, as our book's little blurb at the beginning says, the story of Candace Whitcomb. It doesn't tell quite enough of Candace's story, and I think one of its weaknesses, as I will detail later, is that it never tells us anything of what she was like before she suddenly blows up at this choir that dismissed her and behaves in a completely uncharacteristic way. Candace's fighting back and her general character are familiar aspects of Mary Wilkins Freeman's stories: A New England Nun and The Revolt of Mother. The title of the latter story gives you an impression that it's pretty similar to this story. It's called A Village Singer, and to me it's clearly in the title showing that Candace is identified by and kind of pinned down to, like a pinned butterfly in a museum, these two roles. She lives in a small village. Her life is very closed and narrow and constrained. She's put into the role that life has seemingly placed her in, and part of that role is to be a singer. Because she has no husband, which is an extremely important part of Candace's character, the only real identity or perhaps joy or pleasure she has in life is singing in the choir. At a certain age, when she can no longer sing particularly well, that's taken away from her. Again, as with Freeman, Juet's heroines confront a situation where they feel they have to act, perhaps have to use a standard modern phrase, step out of their comfort zone, and they respond in different ways. The two women in the town poor, by deciding they're going to do something about these poor girls who have been treated so badly by their community, and Sylvia, the girl in a white heron, by deciding to protect the heron's life and not tell the young hunter where it is. In A New England Nun, not about a literal cloistered nun, but a woman who decides to live that way, the Freeman heroine decides that she is not going to pursue men, that she's not going to have one, and just lives a rather private but good-hearted life by herself. The Revolt of Mother is a little different. In this case, the woman actually is married, and she's so angry about her husband's refusal to finish a nice barn that he's promised to work on, that she actually moves out of her house into the barn and forces him to live and be cooked for, etc., in the barn until he works things out. Well, we see a little bit of Candace in both of these other stories. She's almost living like a nun. She doesn't want to. She does want to get married, but she was never able to. Her nephew is in a similar situation. He has been wanting to marry Alma, who to me is Candace's alter ego in the story, kind of her balancing character, but has not been able to yet. Page 393, William Emmons, the choir leader, elderly, stout, and smooth face, the old musical dignitary of the village. They had walked together after their rehearsals, but he had never asked her to marry him. Alma and Candace's nephew Wilson are in a similar situation. However, they're young, so it doesn't seem to be too late. And that's how Freeman rather nicely, something much less complicated, but something like what I've discussed with Shakespeare and the balancing of characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Freeman has balanced these two couples, the younger one and the older one. She throws in another character, the parson, and she tells the story of the revolt of a village singer. Freeman is clever in the beginning of the story in that she describes a lovely, gentle setting. It's spring. The spring had come. It was a warm Sunday. It doesn't look like anything confrontational is going to happen. But Alma and Candace are contrasted right in that fourth paragraph. She is the new soprano. Candace, the old one, had been given her dismissal because her voice was too cracked and uncertain. It says in the left column in 392. It was actually a paid job, so she had lost pay as well as what she cared about in life, and Alma had replaced her. Of course, we know the story. As Alma sings, Candace, who lives conveniently close to the church so she can behave this way, plays loudly on her organ, sings loudly, and destroys the entire thing. The rest of the story, before Candace's final illness, essentially consists of the contrasting reactions of two men to this challenge. One of them is the pastor, who is completely unable to do anything about it, and the other one is Wilson, Candace's nephew. Of course, she has no son because she's a spinster, but he seems to have inherited a lot of her rebellious and stubborn nature, and he will not tolerate the way she behaves any more than she tolerates Alma replacing her. The first effort to deal with Candace in the story is by the minister, and it is unsuccessful, and the second is by her nephew, and it is successful. There's a simple description of the plot. There's a lot more to it, of course. The minister, Mr. Pollard, Freeman does a good job of representing his character from the beginning. as he says, first spoken line on 394, Miss Whitcomb must be reasoned with. He had a slight hesitation of speech, says the narrator, not an impediment. In other words, he does not need a speech therapist. He just takes a moment to think of what he has to say. And this is carried on throughout the story. It pretty much presents him as a man who is not going to be able to deal with the suddenly fiery Candace. The minister gives a speech full of hesitations, trying to stop her from performing her Sunday morning activity of wrecking the service again. And gives her the out of saying that he knows she didn't really intend to do it. She says, of course I intended to, and I'm going to do it again. And then there's an interesting kind of biblical touch here. The photograph album that the choir gave her as sort of a little bribe to accept the fact that she was suddenly fired is resting under her feet, and she says, makes a nice footstool, don't it? Perhaps you can see why I say biblical. The psalm that says, I will make your enemies your footstool. I don't know if Freeman was thinking of it openly, but it's certainly appropriate. The choir are now her enemies, and she is setting her feet upon them, as the kings of the Old Testament did. She then comes out with a long speech, which I'm not going to say very much about it, except for two important lines. Folks that pretend to be Christians. She will echo that later on page 397 by saying, I don't see any use praying about it. I don't think the Lord's got much to do with it. We'll discuss that theme a little more before finishing on this story. She also says, almost the last sentence of the page, I think the whole key to the story and who you sympathize with is really here. Salvation don't hang on anybody's hitting a high note that I ever heard of. She's saying that for the church to be truly Christian, they should be accepting of people, loving of them however they are, and not fire her without even being honest about it. And you'll recall that she says that's what really offended her. At least tell her openly, you can't sing very well anymore, but don't give her a party and then stick what's called a pink slip, the notice that you're fired, into a photograph album that's meant to be a gift. But she also makes the point that how well she can hit the notes does not have anything to do with whether we are saved, and this, of course, is true. It's all about Jesus, as they sometimes say. It's about our relationship with our Creator and with our Savior, not how well we sing, or indeed how good the preaching is, as she also says. Or is it? To me, that's the whole crux of the story's issue. Does it matter? If someone is singing poorly in a choir, especially somebody who is paid, would you tell them gently, perhaps not as the choir in this story does, but tell them gently and openly and honestly that they need to step aside? Or would you feel that God loves their efforts if they are meant to be worshipful no matter what? I think Mary Freeman wants her readers to be involved in the story and to wonder what they would do in the choir's place, as I asked, or what they would do in Candace's place, whether her behavior was right or wrong. But certainly her nephew Wilson, as introduced on page 394, does not think she is in the right. I'll go in there and break that old organ up into kindling wood. And later he says she ought to behave herself. Now, Wilson is in a difficult position, as described on that same page. He does not want Alma, if she becomes his wife, to live with his mother, but he doesn't have enough money for a home of their own. If Candace would leave Wilson her house and then die, to put it bluntly, Wilson's situation would be saved. But to his credit, he is certainly not waiting for his aunt to die, and he is also not going to let her push him around. That her threat to disinherit him, which would actually make him unable to marry his sweetheart exactly like Candace herself, is now old and unmarried. If it does frighten him, it still doesn't influence him. He shows that New England flintiness, that stubbornness that his aunt shows also, and just keeps telling her that she can't behave that way, that he'll throw the organ out the window, that he's not afraid of her threatening to disinherit him. The thing that doesn't quite work is on page 396, when the minister is thinking about Candace in the right column, it says, Candace Whitcomb had been a quiet woman, so delicately resolute that the quality had been scarcely noticed in her. In other words, whatever stubbornness or resolution she might have in her character had never been noticed. She had been a quiet and gentle woman. The problem is that Freeman has never shown us this. At any rate, she becomes peaceful at the end, and I think the Christianity in the story is really shown, ironically, not in the church, but in Candace's behavior in the final 2 pages, and I think that's what the author means to do. There's a great bit of symbolism where she looks out and sees that the woods are on fire. I think that the destruction of these new spring leaves that were described at the beginning of the story, the violence of the fire, is meant to symbolize Candace's inner behavior, or her emotions and the way she's let them burn up or destroy what had been good relationships. She knows that her nephew is against her. She lies in bed all night without sleeping, and then the next day she says to her sister, Wilson's mother, that she is not going to leave that bed. She's finished. She then truly behaves in a Christian way, saying, I hope the Lord will forgive me, saying she should not have behaved this way, and that she wants Alma and Wilson to come to see her for a reconciliation. She is feeling true penitence, which is one of the Christian virtues, of course, and she even promises the thing that Wilson and Alma needed the most, that they can live in her house when she's gone. But that quirky New England sharpness that Freeman and her characters always have is beautifully still there at the end of the story. We have what could be a schmaltzy scene, could be too sentimental a scene. She asks Alma to sing, Jesus, Lover of My Soul. This great old hymn by Charles Wesley, which certainly has memorable words, and I've seen it used in a poem also, could make, as I said, a sentimental ending. But Freeman just isn't going to allow that. When Alma stops singing, Candace echoes something that she said against Alma to the minister earlier in the story. She says that she sang a little bit flat. She's giving in, she's penitent, she's dying. But this feisty little lady is going to get the last word. You flatted a little on soul. And that's how Mary Wilkins Freeman leaves us and leaves her village singer.